If you want to have self-respect and you don't want to be affected by racism, then the most important thing to have is a sense of power within yourself. This is something that I've thought about a lot in my life. I've experienced racism growing up. I know a lot of people who've experienced racism, and obviously I've read about racism happening out there in the wider world. And as I got older, as I became more successful and I gained a certain amount of power in the external world, I realized suddenly that it meant I was less affected by people directing vitriol and hatred towards me. And it really made me think. I kind of wondered to myself, why is that? If I'm a minority in a country, surely I'll always feel a bit helpless, right, against the majority. I think there's some truth to that. If you're the minority in any country, then you are at some level at the mercy of the majority, just by sheer numbers. At the same time, the way you feel about yourself as a person is really to do with whether you accept yourself, whether you love yourself, but also your sense of helplessness and power in society. So let's say you're an adult and you go to a primary school and some kid calls you a name, right? They make fun of you. It's going to bother you, but it's probably not going to bother you that much. Whereas if an adult, like your colleague or just some random adult says something to you, that's going to bother you a lot more. So why is that? Why is there that difference? It's because you have a lot more power than that kid. The relative power levels between you and that kid are completely different to the relative power levels between you and the other adult, right? You're physically bigger than the kid, you're more worldly than the kid, you're more experienced than the kid, you literally have more power in society than that kid. And because you have more power than that child, what they might say to you, what names they call you, how they insult you, it just isn't going to bother you as much. Why? Because you feel safe, fundamentally. Whereas if an adult says something to you, if an adult says something racist to you, something really offensive, there's kind of your safety is a little bit at risk. I mean, we feel this as animals, really, because we are animals. And so there's always an assessment our brain's making, almost our subconscious is making, but even our conscious mind is making as we live and as we go through the world about safety and risk. And that's the real difference in those situations. So when I thought about that, it made me realize that the most important thing, if you really want to go beyond being the victim of racism, the most important thing is power. If you want to stay in that environment, it's about power. It's about having power. It's about getting power and keeping power. So translating that to, let's say, a minority in a country, let's say black people in America or black people or brown people in the UK, whatever it is, or pick whatever minority you want. That minority group, individuals in that group, what they should focus on is gaining power in society. If they want to ensure that their community as a whole is treated more fairly. Malcolm X knew this, and there's actually a great clip of him in the 60s talking about this vis-a-vis China. I'm going to play that now so you can see.
They used to have a saying that one doesn't have a Chinaman's chance, but they don't say that anymore. They used that expression back when China was weak. But now since Mao Zedong has been successful in making China a strong country, the Chinese have more chance than anybody else. So this saying has become outdated. Well, just as it took a strong China to give a Chinese person respect wherever that Chinese person is found on this earth, when we get a strong Africa, the person of African origin or African ancestry will be respected any place on this earth, even in America. But he will not be respected in America until Africa is strong, just as the Chinaman wasn't respected abroad until China became strong.
So I think that's a fantastic clip. And I think he's spot on. I think that the way humans are, we are pattern matchers and we like to generalize and deal with things in terms of patterns because it makes things easier. So if you feel that a large numbers of people from a particular background suck compared to you, maybe because their country's poorer, maybe because culturally they're not as effective as your culture, whatever it is you believe, right? If you feel that, then you're probably going to discriminate against them negatively. You're probably going to look down at them. Now, is the onus entirely on them to make sure that you don't do that? Isn't the onus also on you to not look at people that way? I think there's an argument there. And this is what we see with protests against racism or protests against colonialism that we've seen in the West in recent years, right? people are basically going on the street saying, we need more fairness, we need less racism, we need less prejudice, we need more equality. Now, the problem I have with these sorts of protests is, fundamentally, I think protesting works best when the objective can be achieved in a short space of time. So for example, if you have someone who's the dictator of a country and the people are fed up with him and they want him out and they come out in masses and protest, well, how can they achieve that objective? Literally, this person just has to step down and it's done. But when you're protesting against racism, apart from getting certain immediate changes made, like people taking down racist portraits or people, I don't know, firing someone who's found to be racist, if it's just protesting against racism in society in general, then it's just not going to be as effective because that requires a long-term change. It requires a shift in mindsets over the long term. And the reason protesting can't be as effective is because in order for protests to be effective, they have to be sustained. You have to be able to sustain that protesting energy over a long period of time, which usually just isn't possible. It just isn't possible. So that's why I think if you're going to do a protest, then it's always going to be more effective when the outcome can be achieved in a short space of time. And that also means that you can specify what the outcome is. So anyway, going back to racism. So this is why I think protesting against racism, yes, it can feel good and it can raise the profile of it, but ultimately it's not going to get you the answer. In some respects, like I said at the beginning, because you're always going to have a minority and a majority in a lot of these countries that are mixed, ultimately, the onus is on the minority group to make sure that their standing in society is good. So the majority group also have to be liberal and open-minded, but the minority group also have to raise their profile. Is this fair? It's not fair. It's absolutely not fair, but it's the reality of the world we live in. But that's about the group. What about the individual? So translating that to the individual level, the way that I am going to feel self-actualized when reaching the top of Maslow's hierarchy, right? The way I'm going to really get there is by finding a sense of power within myself. Now, there are two ways to do this, right? I think it's a hybrid of the two that is ideal, but one way is you literally don't care what people are saying about you or thinking about you. You just love yourself and you live your life that way. The other way is you gain actual power. You gain power, you gain economic power, you gain physical power, and that way people can't hurt you as easily. You're occupying a position of power in society, meaning you can dictate terms more than you otherwise would have been able to. I think personally, it's a hybrid of the two approaches that make sense. So having the money to take care of your life, having abundant money so that you can put that money behind the causes that you believe in, you can craft the life that you want for yourself. And at the same time, the internal work of not being a victim and knowing your own strength and value. The internal work is the most important out of the two, actually, because if you can do that internal work fully, then you don't need the external power. But I still advocate for the external power because even if you've done the internal work and you love yourself, you could be in a situation where someone doesn't like you, that the majority group are actually impinging on your freedoms or trying to hurt you. And in that situation, having power is the way out. And we can talk about power on the level of countries as well in terms of geopolitics. I mean, look at Ukraine versus Russia. Why is Ukraine the victim here? Of course, they got invaded, so they're the victim. But if they were militarily more powerful than Russia, if they had more power than Russia, then this wouldn't be an issue right now. They would have been able to repel Russia. In fact, Russia wouldn't have invaded in the first place. So the power dynamic was absolutely critical there. The same with Israel and Gaza. Whichever side you support, realistically, when you look at it, Israel has a lot more economic, military, and technological power than the Palestinians, than Hamas, right? So they're going to win. And I think that's how the world is. I think power as a country, you absolutely should be looking to secure your power base. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have the most powerful military. It just means that you have leverage when it comes to negotiations, when it comes to military tactics. You have leverage, so economic power. Economic power usually translates into military power, as in it can. But if you don't have economic power, you can't really have military power. So economic power is the fundamental basis of it. And everything sort of comes from there. Best example of this is China. China has built massive economic power, just like Malcolm X said they would. And because they've done that, And because they have this powerful narrative, these themes and narratives within the country as well, they can build technological power, which they have done, and military power. And so now they're respected on the world stage. They're seen as a threat by the United States. Just think about that. The United States sees China as a bigger threat than it sees Russia, even though Russia's been playing the great power game for a lot longer. And that's just thanks to China's level of power rising so quickly. So overall, what I'm trying to say is that gaining power in life and gaining power in society is one of the best ways to make sure that you have leverage, both in your personal life, in terms of your community, within a wider community, in terms of your country, within the world. Gaining power is a good thing. Having power means you can operate from that position of power, and that gives you choice. If you don't have power, you don't have a choice. You're going to live according to the dictates of somebody else who does have more power. Now, power, when I talk about power, none of this has any bearing on ethics or morality. Just because I have more power over you and therefore I can dictate the terms doesn't mean I have the moral right to do that. So morality that's a completely separate issue. We're not talking about what is just and what is morally right. I'm just trying to focus on the reality of life and the reality of the world. We can say all the nice things and hold hands and sing kumbaya or whatever, but at the end of the day, power is what matters. Power is what ultimately determines a lot of these outcomes.